Hello everyone, and welcome to Digital Culture and Language with me, Richard Pinner, and this is the final content lecture of this course. And today we'll be talking about something that I call augmented communication, and this is an area of my own research, so I'll be talking a little bit about the study that I did and the book that I wrote about it, and just talking really about how smartphones are affecting face-to-face communication. So the plan for today is to sort of do a bit of a recap about what we looked at last week, last lesson in the Dasein lecture, and then we'll talk about just how my research came about, and then I'll explain what augmented communication means. There's already a term, augmented and alternative communication, so we'll talk about that. And then finally, I'll go over my research and the different types of augmented communication that I identified. So to get started with the Dasein recap, this is kind of important. I wanted to just do a quick matching activity. And these questions are just designed to get you thinking about some of these ideas. So, question 1. Research suggests using cell phones for only a half hour a day for 10 years doubles one risk of what? 2. The soreness in our fingers and wrists from texting too much is called what? 3. What is PIU? 4. Quarter of teens in the US are connected to a device within how long of waking up each morning? 5. Most teens send at least how many text messages per day? And 6. Over the past 20 years, our society has seen a 40% decline in indicators of what? And researchers are linking this trend with the rise of digital communication technologies. Let's just spend a moment to answer those questions. Okay, so the answer to question 1 is B. Apparently research shows that using phones doubles your risk of cancer. 2. The soreness in our fingers is called text claw. A. 3. PIU is problematic internet use. 4. Quarter of teens are connected to a device within 5 minutes of waking up each morning. Some people are actually connected as soon as they wake up. It's the first thing they touch is they look at their phone. But this is sometimes because people use their phone for their alarm. Most teens send at least 100 text messages per day, and over the past 20 years, we've seen a decrease or a decline in indicators of empathy, according to researchers. Okay, so what does this tell us about our use of the internet and our connection to digital devices? Well, it shows that there are a lot of problems associated with it, and people basically are very fearful and frightened of the amount of time that we now spend connected to technology. But as we've discussed, it's an inevitability because of the type of society that we've now created. If you want to be ordinary, if you just want to be a normal person in today's society, you need to be part of the networked society. I mentioned a very good friend of mine who chose not to have a mobile phone, and it's quite a hindrance for him and for his friends. When he doesn't have a mobile phone, we have to change the normal ways that we might interact in terms of, for example, meeting, arranging a place to meet. Without a mobile phone, life is just very different. Let's not forget the amplifying effect of technology as well. So a lot of the problems that we associate with the technology directly are not a product of the technology, but they are amplified, and their problems are amplified because of the technology, but that we can't necessarily blame the technology itself. Let's also bear in mind this theory of extended mind. As we familiarize ourselves more and more with the technologies that are at our disposal, basically we become more and more dependent on them, and they become more and more part of ourselves, more part of extensions of ourselves. So we talked about this Dasein, or this disconnection from reality. Sure, this is a serious problem, but if that guy was reading a newspaper, he might have walked into the wall as well, or he could have been looking at his shoes. So I don't know about any of you, but when I was a young person, I used to always look at my shoes while I was walking, and I bumped into a lamppost a few times. I didn't have a phone in my hand. Maybe I'm just an idiot. The smartphone zombie idea, especially when we think about young people, this is a unfair judgment that we put on society, and I think it's inaccurate in many ways, and I've tried to show that with this course. The idea that you're not experiencing real life if you look at it through a lens is an interesting one. There's certainly some truth to this, but also there's also an aspect of it being completely wrong. You can still have some very meaningful experiences, and they might be purely online. I actually have a friend who I have never met in real life, and we play a computer game together called Red Dead Redemption 2, and he's a really good friend of mine, and we chat about personal things and have meaningful conversations, but we do it all in Wild West saloons or during missions in the game. So those are still meaningful interactions, even though they happen online, or they don't happen in real life. They happen in some virtual simulated world. This concept that you're going to be more social, or you're going to value the things that really matter more if you don't have the technology around you, that's technological determinism. We've also talked about the differences between online and offline. So just because you're online doesn't mean that you are no longer existing in the real world. So for example, I'm currently online right now. I'm sitting at a computer, but yet here I am, very much physically still present. In science fiction novels, sometimes when people go online, like in The Matrix, when Neo goes into the Matrix, he still has a physical body which can be damaged. His consciousness is in the Matrix, it's in the online world, but he still has a physical body, and that's the same for all of us as well. And yet people tend to forget that, I think. Now I'd like to discuss this quote attributed to Albert Einstein. It goes, "I fear the day that technology will surpass our human interaction. The world will have a generation of idiots." This quote is very much something that people are worried about right now, and this generation of idiots is something that's certainly implied in many discussions around the use of technology, and especially smartphones. So this is how my research came about. I got interested in how we use smartphones in face-to-face communication. So when I first came to Japan quite a few years ago now, I had a group of mates, and I was the only foreigner in the group. Everyone else was Japanese. And we were very lucky one day because through some kind of mutual connection, we were introduced to Maiko-san, a sort of trainee geisha, and her name was Chiori-san. And this is, I'm afraid to say, this is quite a lot of years ago now. This is over a decade and a half ago, and me and my friends met up again fairly recently, a few years ago. And it had been a long time since we'd met Chiori-san, and we were remembering what an interesting night that was. And we thought to ourselves, I wonder where Chiori-san is now. And I said to my friend Mako, who was with me at the time, I said to him, I wonder where Chiori-san is now. This person we'd met a long time ago, that we'd only sort of met her once or twice. But she was an interesting person, so we were wondering about her. And anyway, my friend Mako proceeded to take out his mobile phone and Google Chiori-san straight away. And we found out that she was no longer a geisha, and in fact she had opened up her own organic food shop, which was really interesting and different. And we started talking about that straight away. So from having gone from this kind of memory, I wonder where she is now, we were going on to like, oh, I wonder why she ended up changing her life so much. Oh, we could go and visit her organic food shop. And the conversation took a completely different turn. And I realized that that conversation turn would have been completely impossible without the search engine and without the smartphone in his pocket. And my friend, several times I noticed him utilizing the phone. Now, we were out there and I was speaking mainly in Japanese, which I'm not particularly fluent in. And we were relying on our phones quite a bit, and we were language switching as well a fair bit. Mainly we were talking Japanese, but we were using the phones also to sort of help us if we needed to translate something and things like that. So we were relying on our phones quite a lot for the communication. And as an applied linguist, I got really interested in this, and I started to wonder about it from a foreign language and intercultural communication situation. So I started taking some notes and started doing what's called autoethnographic research. So that's ethnographic research, but basically the research subject is myself, hence the auto. So, but it's very much not just about me, the research. It's about, you know, my context, my situation, the people I interact with. It's an ethnography. And I started doing this, and I was collecting data for this study at the exact same time that I was collecting data for my PhD, as it would happen. So I was kind of doing two big, large-scale studies at the same time. One was my PhD, and the other one was this book, Augmented Communication, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan. And my research was, as I said, an autoethnographic study focusing on my life in Japan mainly, but also whenever I went back to the UK. And I also visited several other countries as well at the time, Argentina, Hong Kong, and Singapore. That was in the old days when I was a bit more jet-setting than I am now. I looked at mass media representations as well from around the world in different places. And I also made personal observations about my own use and my friends' use. And also I might observe, for example, if I was in a cafe and people were talking, I might observe them, even though they didn't know I was watching them. So they were totally anonymous, of course, but I would include my observations of other people who I didn't even know. And I did this for about 3 years. I had data spanning 3 years. I kept detailed notes. So here's an example of my data. So this is my house. This is where my TV is in my living room. And we were watching some Japanese show. I think this is Nanda Kore, which is a show my wife and my son love watching. Me, not so much. Anyway, in the interview, so there's a person here in the studio, and she was asked a question about something, and she is showing a photograph that she took on her phone to the camera. And what struck me about this was the fact that it was a bit strange that they didn't just get the photo and put it onto the image, but they actually wanted her to hold her phone up to the camera and show it that way. And I wondered if maybe that wasn't planned, if it wasn't prepared. Because if it was planned, surely they would have downloaded the photo off her phone so they could show a more high quality resolution image of it. But rather, they just wanted her to hold the screen up to the camera. This is an example of how using your phone as part of a conversation is so natural. I also posted things onto social networks, and I kept detailed notes of comments that I might see or things that people posted in open forums. So, for example, this person's saying, They were complaining about the use of phones, and this person said, I disagree. Cell phones have allowed me to communicate with people about important and non-important things at a moment's notice, and they choose to answer the phone or look at the text and respond. I have a map app on my phone and a notepad app that allows me to remember important things, like sending flowers on Mother's Day. People have taken recordings of professionals acting in most unprofessional ways, allowing us to investigate acts of injustice. As with every new invention, we need to mature in our use of it, but I honestly believe it has helped improve society and our relationships with each other. So these are quite interesting. These are people also sort of avoiding technological determinism. I'm not the only person who thinks that blaming our phone is actually unhelpful, because we're not actually dealing with the true issue, which is a societal issue. Just a quick funny to help you concentrate. This is a little comic that I enjoyed. Life Before Google. It's a short story. I just thought of something I'd like to know more about. Ah, that's a damn shame. The end. Obviously now, if you were sitting next to someone and they had something they wanted to know more about, you'd sit there and you'd Google it together. You'd learn about it together using your phone. Here's a clip from Friends, and it doesn't work. You'd think I would have checked that before recording the video, wouldn't you? Okay, I got it now. So here's the clip.
So you like the beer?
I do. Although it's actually a lager.
Huh. What's the difference between beer and lager?
I don't know. We could look it up.
Things are about to get wild.
So what struck me about that simple video of the Friends episode was really just how unusual it seems now. So I think that episode aired in around 2002 or 2003, which is nearly 20 years ago now. And I just found it interesting that, you know, them looking up something, the difference between lager and beer in a dictionary was such a big thing, when, you know, nowadays checking something on your phone is actually very normal. If they'd had mobile phones, they would have checked that and it wouldn't have seemed like an awkward situation. So this brought me to the question of, are smartphones really ruining face-to-face communication? My observations led me to think otherwise. So that's how my research came about. Now, I decided to call this Augmented Communication. And of course, the first thing I needed to do, if I'm going to call it that, is check to see whether there's already a term called Augmented Communication in use. And there actually is. It's called Augmentative and Alternative Communication. And it relates mainly to people with speech impairments. So people who have trouble either writing or speaking, especially speaking, might rely on some type of technology in order to enable them to have conversations or enable them to express themselves. So an example might be a machine like this, where you can press buttons that will help you communicate your meaning. Another famous example would be this one. So Jean-Dominique Bauby dictating his memoir to his speech therapist Claude Mendeville. So Bauby was a former editor of Elle magazine, the fashion magazine in France. And one day while he was driving his car, he suffered a massive stroke. And when he woke up in hospital, he had lost the use of he was completely paralyzed. He'd lost the use of his body. The only thing that he could still move was one eyelid, so he could kind of blink like that. And but the rest of his brain was unimpaired. He still had all his thought processes, and his personality wasn't affected either. So it was just his body that he lost the use of. So this is called locked-in syndrome, when people, their mind functions normally, but they can no longer use their body. Now, this is a quote from the memoir he wrote: "My diving bell becomes less oppressive and my mind takes flight like a butterfly." He wrote, together with Claude Mendeville, the most beautiful book, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, and it's even been turned into a film. And I strongly recommend you have a look at this, because it's an absolutely beautiful book. The way it was written was very straightforward in some ways, although it obviously took a long time. So Claude Mendeville had a plaque with the alphabet on, written in order of what was of frequency of the letters. So E is the most frequent letter in the language, so that was the first letter. And she would just go down the list of letters, and Bobby would simply blink his eye when she reached the letter that he wanted. After a while, it became obvious what word he was trying to spell. She would confirm it, and then she would write it down. And in this way, he dictated his entire book to her. And as I say, it's a truly beautiful piece of work. Another famous example of augmentative and assistive communication would be Professor Stephen Hawking. And when he was alive, he because he had multiple sclerosis, he was paralyzed, and by the end of his life, in the last few years of his life, the only muscle he could move, I think, was a muscle in his right cheek. And still, somehow, thanks to the amazing technologies, slightly more advanced than the ones available to Bobby, of course, but Hawking was able to dictate, was able to write books still, and he was able to have a voice through a computer, his distinctive computer voice, and he was also able to give public lectures for many, many years. And if you imagine his life without this technology, obviously it would have been very different, and we would be deprived of some fantastic insights into science as well that he provided us. This is a trailer for the Diving Bell and the Butterfly, which we're not going to watch now, but this is a video of Professor Stephen Hawking and his famous voice.
Well, it is time now for our latest Bloomberg West series, Bioengineering The Census, a closer look at the technology on the frontiers of medical science. Today, we're looking at the machine behind physicist Stephen Hawking and how smartphone technology is helping him communicate.
Medicine has not been able to cure me, so I rely on technology to help me communicate and live.
That vital system that Professor Stephen Hawking relies on has recently got an upgrade. Tasks that used to take 3 to 4 minutes, like opening a Word document, now take around 10 seconds. Intel has been working with Hawking for decades, and the latest upgrade was over 2 years in the making.
So we completely changed the way that he's interfacing with these aspects of the system to have him not rely on the mouse. So based on whatever he happens to be doing, we would surface the most logical things that he might want to do.
That also applies to Hawking's text-to-speech system. UK startup SwiftKey, whose software runs predictive text apps on smartphones, has doubled Hawking's speech rate. It considers what Hawking was last writing, whether there were any errors, and then tries to predict which character he might choose next. To do that, the SwiftKey program has to learn how Hawking writes and speaks by analyzing dozens of his documents, some published, others not.
The tests we ran showed that of a given body of text made up of a certain number of characters, Professor Hawking would actually only have to enter around 15 to 20% of those characters, and the rest would be inferred.
Now here's the crazy part. Everything Stephen Hawking does on his computer is triggered by one muscle in his cheek. An infrared sensor detects when his cheek muscle moves up, just the way our smartphones can sense when it's close to the face. Future versions of this technology are aiming to take a bigger range of movement into account.
But he can actually today say yes and no by moving, his eyebrows and by pulling his mouth. So one of the things that we've been working on is using essentially a camera system to detect these different movements. So now he can, for example, undo things by saying no, rather than having to go and manipulate the whole screen to get to a backspace button, for example.
Intel is even trying to develop brain control interfaces, which could help people who can no longer move any muscles at all. That won't necessarily happen to Stephen Hawking, but with the market forecast to reach $55 billion in 2016, it represents the next leap for assistive technologies.
Okay, so there we go. Now, obviously, sadly, Professor Stephen Hawking is no longer with us, but I think it's really impressive that he was able to have the kind of communication that he could, thanks to the augmentative and assistive communication technology. This GoTalk is one of the most common devices developed for people with speech impairments. And I also have a bit of personal experience of this myself, because my stepfather had an operation to remove a tumor in his brain a few years ago, and he was left unable to communicate, unfortunately, due to some complication with the surgery. Sorry, my dog just decided to leave from under my desk there. So what my mom did was, my mom created like a chart with words and pictures that he would commonly want to use. And even though he was no longer really able to speak, he could still communicate with her thanks to her efforts. Now, I feel like it's important to mention that side of it before I then move into the thing I'm discussing when I talk about augmented communication. So augmented communication is different from augmentative and alternative communication, but obviously the two have similarities. Now, what happens when people who do not have speech impairments utilize some form of technology with their communication? This is what I was interested in. So, I'm not I think obviously, the work with people with speech impairments is very interesting, but a lot of people who don't have speech impairments are using technology to assist their communication as well. So this is what I was kind of interested in. One of the things that I noticed, so I started conducting the research and started taking notes, and straight away one of the things I noticed was that people use their phones to show photographs. And obviously you could carry a photograph around in your wallet or on your person. And in the old days, people used to carry photographs around. But now it's not necessary, because you have access to possibly thousands of photos from years ago on your phone. Your phone can store thousands of images. And I noticed that sometimes people will use their phone to show a picture to bring what I termed immediate authenticity to a conversation. So this is something I'll talk about here. So in this post, it's a famous blog called Humans of New York, and a photographer who goes around just talking to people in New York, just random people, and asking them what they're doing. And then he always writes a little quote and takes a nice photograph. But what struck me about this one was that the people are blurry in this one, and what's important is that they're holding their phone and they're talking about when they first met and how the guy was very nervous, and one of their friends actually took a photo of the first time that he asked this girl out, and that you can see his body language and how kind of nervous he's looking, and they're showing the photo to bring this kind of immediate authenticity there. So here are some of the other findings that I found. So this question of, are smartphones really ruining communication? I think the answer is certainly not. Changing, definitely. I found 4 categories of how we might use phones to augment our communication, and I'll just go through each one in turn. So the first one, multimodal augmenting. This is another example of that. So bringing this immediate authenticity, we use it to bring other types of media into our conversation. So instead of describing the picture, we can just show the picture and talk about it. If we're talking about a meme, we can show a meme. We don't need to describe the meme. It's much easier, makes much more sense to just simply show the picture or the meme. Same with videos as well, and even websites and other multimedia. So multimodal augmenting might involve also Googling things and showing them as well. So another example, a few years ago, I was in an izakaya with some of my colleagues, and I work with a wonderful man called Professor Ikeda Makoto. And my friends were laughing about something, and I was like, hey, well, what are you laughing about? And they said, oh, we think that this guy, Nagatani, we think that he looks like Professor Ikeda. And I was like, I've never heard of this guy. And then they Googled him and showed me some pictures and I was like, oh yeah, it does look a bit like Professor Ikeda. And so even though I knew nothing about the situation and I would have not been able to join the joke, thanks to multimodal augmenting, I was able to share the joke a little bit. Here's another example of multimodal augmenting. So this is a few years ago when my son had just got the Shichigonen. Hang on. Sorry about that. So when my son had just done the Shichiko-san celebration, he was 5 years old at the time. And so we got professional photos taken of him. And this is a photo of my partner and a friend of hers at my son's swimming club sharing these photos because they'd both just had them taken. So obviously, if you were talking about having these photos taken, but you didn't have a phone to share them with, it would be a bit of a boring conversation. But thanks to having the phone, you can actually use multimodal augmentation to show a picture of something that you're talking about. And I found that the most common thing was usually showing pictures. The next category is meta-augmenting. And what I mean by this is when you actually talk about your phone. So because our phones are quite a big part of our lives, we might actually not just use the phone as conversation, but actually talk about it as we use it. An example might be you have a new app on your phone and you show it to someone and you show them what the app can do. Or like, for example, in this one, my sister had this horrible app called Face Juggler, which will swap your face round with the other person that you're with. So this is my niece, Bethany, with my face. It's horrendous. And this is her face on my head. And my sister took this picture and we started talking about it. And then it was even shared on Facebook. And so we continued the conversation actually online as well, which I'll come to later. There's also this term of things being instagenic as well. So whether or not you think it's superficial, the fact is that many people will want to take photographs and want to remember things, and they will be talking about getting that picture or using the app whilst they're there. So even if, no matter how you feel about it, it's still a topic of conversation that people will actually talk about their phones. So I call that meta-augmenting. The next one is augmented cognition. And we'll go back to this quote from Einstein, who is attributed to having said, "I fear the day that technology will surpass our human interaction and we'll have a generation of idiots." Actually, Einstein never said this. One thing Einstein did actually say, so he was in New York, and a clever reporter ran up to Einstein with a question from the Edison test, a test of memorized facts that was popular at the time. And they asked Einstein the speed of sound. One of the most clever living scientists at the time, and they wanted to see if he knew some questions from the Edison test. And they asked him, "Einstein, what's the speed of sound?" And Einstein didn't know. And he replied, "I do not carry such information in my mind, since it is readily available in books." Now, this is a good example.
Science. A man and his boy making planets. Hey, how about we use a ping pong ball for Pluto, and then Jupiter...
Actually, I don't think Pluto's a planet.
Of course Pluto's a planet, son. I learned that in the 3rd grade.
Well, yeah, but, you know, they changed it.
Morty, nobody changed the planets.
I just Googled it. Pluto's not a planet. They changed it in 2006.
Okay, so maybe you recognize this kind of conversation. Have you ever won an argument by using Google? Please answer in the chat. Have you ever been arguing with somebody and they didn't agree with what you said, so you broke off the conversation to search online and maybe use Google to prove that you were right and they were wrong? So this is an example of augmented communication and what I call augmented cognition, where we use our phone to add something that we didn't already know. We might be Googling things on the fly, or we might be using it to learn something, or perhaps to just prove ourselves right and to win an argument. Similar to what Einstein said about not keeping things in his mind. So this is the theory of extended mind. And this is something that I use the term exo-memory to describe when we might have things stored in our phone or stored on online that we know we have access to instantly, so we don't need to actually keep it in our mind. We keep it in our exo-memory, which external memory, just like how a computer might have an external hard drive, you can imagine your phone as an external hard drive for your own actual memory. Another example of augmented cognition. So here's a photo of my father at a STEAM fair back in the good old days before the pandemic, when people would go out and do things. And these men, they're all over 60. And the guy on the right, the guy in the middle is actually over 70. And the guy on the right, Bruce, has just bought a new house, and he's explaining to my dad and their friend Alistair where the house is. Now, they were not sure where the house was, so Bruce got Google Maps out, showed them where it is exactly on the map. They can actually walk down the driveway of the new house using the Google Maps Street View. And then he took them to the website of the estate agent so they can actually do a virtual tour of my friend, of Bruce's new house. So they're actually, doing a lot more. Like, this conversation is completely different from how it would be without the phones, because they're actually doing a virtual tour of Bruce's new house. Instead of just him telling them about it, they're actually actively looking it up, walking around it, and seeing exactly where it is, all thanks to a smartphone in their hand. Those men are also, fairly old, and I think that provides further evidence against this kind of reductive concept of the digital native, digital immigrants idea, because those men were naturally doing that in their conversation. Another thing, so similar to exo-memory, exoknowledge, I think, is perhaps a term that we might use here. So we know we can learn something if we Google it. So we don't need to remember those things, but we simply need to know strategies of how to find it. Another example might be, let's say we're arranging to meet up with somebody, and we didn't decide which restaurant to go to, because exoknowledge allows us to just sort of look on a website and choose the best restaurant nearby to us. So we can rely on our smartphones even for deciding where to go, and everything is much more on the fly, and we can be much more flexible if we have a phone. Again, this has a lot in common with this is basically the theory of extended mind, which we discussed at the beginning of the course. The final type of augmented communication is augmented participation. And this involves actually bringing people into the conversation who are not physically there. So in this case, this was in Argentina. I was stuck at the airport. My flight got 24 hours delayed. And I texted my friend who was in Argentina, who lived in Argentina, and told him I was delayed. And he was actually teaching a class. He's a teacher trainer, or he was at the time. And he was actually teaching a class with other future colleagues, he called them. And he just sent me a picture. And obviously, you know, he's in the class, but he's telling these students my situation. Oh, this person who's come over from Japan to give a talk is now stuck in the airport. Let's say hello to him. So he's brought all these people into the conversation. He's brought me into their conversation. I'm part of the class all of a sudden, just through a simple text message. I noticed this also with Facebook, so I can check in on Facebook and show where I am when I was in Argentina, and people can sort of join in and say, oh yeah, I've been there. They can see the photos that I'm sharing, and some of the people are actually with me physically, and some of the people are just following me through my social networks, but we can all participate together thanks to the affordances of the technology. Okay, of course, there are disadvantages too. So one of the big disadvantages would be related to the digital divide. And this might be a financial problem that people can't always afford the technology that they need to do this. You know, not everyone can afford the kind of technology that Stephen Hawking had either at his disposal to be able to communicate. But also it could be to do with literacies as well. Digital literacies are also going to be a big factor. And this could be at a national level, the resources and the digital resources of a nation, or it could also be at a more personal level. So within even wealthy nations like Japan, there are some people who have access to the technology and some who don't. And there may also be sometimes an age factor there as well. But whatever its cause, and there are many causes, there's always a digital divide to think about. Also, there's this problem with multitasking. So one of the criticisms of people using their phones during face-to-face conversation is that they are not present in the moment. Well, although this isn't necessarily true, there is definitely some truth to it, because when we are multitasking, we are less likely to be able to focus on the one task that we're doing. We're more easily distracted, and we don't have that much of a working memory. Our working memory is the same as it has always been. Perhaps in the future we'll develop a larger capacity for having working memory, or our brains might get better at multitasking. But certainly at the moment, there seems to be very little evidence that we actually have got better at multitasking. And so if you're trying to have a conversation and Google something on your phone, obviously you're doing two things at once. That means that you might not be listening to the conversation as well as you would be if you were just listening to the conversation. Another aspect that I want to bring in is something we've talked about before, the whole problem of critical thinking, the media monopoly. If you don't know something and you Google it really quickly during a conversation, you might not actually have the time to check your source, or you might not have the time to get a decent, deep understanding of it, and then you are using it in the conversation directly. So you're spreading whatever information you have very quickly onto another person, and they also are not going to have time to critically evaluate the information that you're giving them. And in this way, we could see, similar to how misinformation spreads online very quickly, if people are using this kind of information in face-to-face communication as well, we could see a spreading of misinformation in face-to-face communication as well. So I think that's also something to be aware of. Anyway, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about today in terms of augmented communication. So I hope that you've enjoyed today's lecture, and we'll do some reflections about it in the online forum now. But thank you very much for your attention, and see you later, alligator. Our next class will be an assessment workshop, and I'll give you more details of that in a moment. So thank you very much for your attention, and all the best.